Okay, everyone, we're going to get started. Thank you all for joining us for this resource sharing project webinar, Who's in There? Demystifying Incarcerated Survivors. We have been just so lucky to partner with Just Detention International on our Rural Training and Technical Assistance Grant for the last 2 years, and so excited to have folks from JDI join us for this webinar today. So please let me introduce you to Tara. Tara is a senior program director in JDI's Washington, D.C. office. She provides training and technical assistance to corrections agencies on preventing and responding to sexual abuse in detention. She's been working on the development and implementation of the Prison Rape Elimination Act standards for more than 10 years, including at the National PREA Resource Center. Welcome, Tara.
Great. Thank you so much, Leah. And welcome to everyone that is with us today. I was just thinking that seeing everyone share where they're from, that it would be great if Zoom had a mapping function so we could have a virtual map of where everyone is calling in from today. I think that would, I would certainly be excited to see that because there is an impressive group and representation across the country. So Just Detention International, or JDI, that's how I'll probably refer to it today, is really pleased to partner with the Resource Sharing Project to present this webinar. Before we get into the webinar itself, I would like to tell you a little bit more about JDI. JDI is a health and human rights organization that seeks to end sexual violence in all forms of detention, including adult prisons and jails, juvenile facilities, lockups, community confinement settings, and immigration detention. In fact, JDI was founded by survivors of sexual abuse in confinement and have been instrumental in the development of the PREA standards and implementation across the country. JDI's core goals are to hold government officials accountable, to change public attitudes about sexual violence behind bars, and to ensure survivors get the help that they need. We believe that rape is not part of the penalty and that we can achieve the goal of ending sexual violence in detention. JDI enjoys working with victim advocates since the services you all provide are so instrumental to helping inmate survivors to heal. I will now turn things back over to Leah to have her tell you a bit more about the Resource Sharing Project.
Thanks so much. As I'm sure many of you on the webinar today know, that the Rural Training and Technical Assistance Project, we are one of a number of rural OVW technical assistance providers, but the focus of our technical assistance and training is on helping dual and multi-service advocacy organizations provide really strong sexual assault services. We are hosting this webinar today, and we are going to unpack a few things. So we're going to talk about some common misconceptions that all of us in this country have about folks in detention, but that we often hear from rural advocates in particular. We're going to gain a deeper awareness of the needs of incarcerated survivors who've experienced sexual violence. We're going to explore how to apply the advocacy skills you already know and use every day in your larger community in a corrections setting. And we're going to hear from a formerly incarcerated survivor. I just want to take a quick moment at the top of this webinar to let you know that this is a topic that can be upsetting to some, especially those who've experienced violence. So I just want you to take care of yourself and know that you are able to leave the room, go to the bathroom, take a break, and come back to the webinar whenever you would like, or just know we are recording this webinar and it will be up on our website. So if it's easier for you or would be in any way more helpful for you to watch a recording to be able to pause, that will always be a possibility in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you, Leah. Now I want to hear from all of you. I know there are several people joining us. Let's see here. It looks like our numbers, we have nearly 60 people today, so there's lots of you. And we want to take a minute to have you think about what comes to mind when you hear the word inmate. Now, please don't overthink this. Just put into the chat box your initial thoughts or describe what images come to mind. Don't forget, like Leah has mentioned already, to where it says the to portion in the chat box to select all panelists and all attendees, so then everyone can see the comments that you're submitting. And please remember that this is a safe space, and your honesty will help us as a group to learn and grow from each other. So I'll give you a few minutes to chime in.
Okay, so we've already gotten a few. Someone wrote a Black man or a woman, criminal, detained person who may or may not have committed a crime, offenders, criminal, orange jumpsuit. Someone wrote orange is the new black. Inhumane standards of living, rehabilitation, second chances. Young male prisoner. Lots of folks reiterating orange jumpsuit, bars, cage, people, a person that is confined in an institution, person, mother, father, a cell, people in cages, people, a felon or criminal, someone locked up, usually a male, violence.
Great. Thank you, Leah. Thank you all for chiming in. I appreciate your thoughts. I mean, these are absolutely images that a lot have come to mind for many people. And, you know, from my experience, people's images of what a prison or jail is like or who an inmate is heavily influenced by the media and pop culture. Jordan, a survivor of sexual abuse in detention, said it best. Quote, "The way we perceive it is that society treats or handles and deals with us in the manner in which they do because they are unaware of the facts and realities of incarcerated life. They only know the myths and notions about prison life as inaccurately communicated by television, news, radio, movies, and so-called documentaries," unquote. And let's face it, like Jordan described, the depictions of detention settings and of inmates are typically not positive ones. Violence is a common theme, both among inmates and between staff and inmates. And I would have been surprised if someone had not mentioned Orange is the New Black, or years ago, people probably more commonly mentioned Shawshank Redemption or The Green Mile, to say nothing of the quote unquote real life shows that are on TV about incarcerated life. And I personally find it not uncommon at all to hear comments on TV, whether it be sitcoms or in movies, that explicitly or allude to the idea of sexual abuse in prison, about how someone will be treated or if they're ready for what they might face if they were incarcerated. And our images of inmates are not limited to men. Women inmates are also stereotyped as violent and ruthless. When I was offered my first job working with incarcerated women, I was often asked by friends if I would be okay going into a prison. And I'm asked regularly by people who learn about the work that I do, whether or not I feel safe. Safety and security is important, don't get me wrong. However, my hope is that the information we share today will shift this lens and alter your perceptions of who prisoners are, and you will leave this webinar feeling more confident in providing services to incarcerated survivors. So here's another one for you. As advocates, what are the first words or images that come to mind when you hear the term survivor or victim? Like before, take a few minutes and share your responses in the chat box.
Okay, warrior, child, strength, mother, woman, innocent, powerful, someone who needs help, violated, resilient, strength or bravery, trauma, caught, resilient, strength, vulnerable, identity.
Wow, thank you. That I wasn't quite sure what folks would chime in with this prompt, and those were all very, very powerful. Oh, here comes one more.
Survivor, someone who has been through it and came out the other side. Victim, someone still in the situation.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, So keeping those very powerful words that Leah read off in mind, let's take a look at this image. I mean, I personally always find these images to be incredibly powerful. I think they make people really think about how someone is treated based on who they are thought to be. You're all familiar with some of the myths and stereotypes surrounding sexual abuse and sexual harassment and how they can lead to victim blaming and the silencing of survivors. As advocates, you have worked hard to make tremendous progress to dispel the harmful misconceptions about sexual violence in the community, but there is a great deal of work still to be done with regards to sexual abuse in detention. Individuals in detention settings also need our help. In a few minutes, I will share some facts and figures, but take a moment and think about the images portrayed on these slides. We need advocates such as yourself to help us help incarcerated survivors. There's a man, Joe, who is a part of JDI Survivor Council. Joe is featured in a JDI video where he shares his story of being sexually abused while he was in confinement and how he was treated in the aftermath. The title of the movie is My Name is Joe, and you learn that the advocate who came in to provide services to inmates called him by his first name. To everyone else in the prison, he was known only by his inmate number. It seems like a small gesture, but to Joe, being called by his first name was a monumental experience. While you may be willing to provide services to whoever needs them, there might still be some hesitation about providing services, whether they be in person, over the phone, or via mail to someone who is incarcerated. Please share those concerns. Know that a concern you have may very well be a concern that someone else has that's participating today.
All right, so someone wrote interference from correctional officers or other staff, a lack of confidentiality, the availability of services, safety, confidentiality, respect, trauma-informed therapy spaces, access to services, retaliation for using our services. If your tribe has no program or offers no services currently, how does one start? Difficulty being in compliance with VAWA. Safety, confidentiality and appropriate spaces, safety and vulnerability for inmate, confidentiality, access, serving dual survivor and perpetrator, regulations of the institution, the ability to have access to the inmate, abusive staff.
Great. Thank you, Leah, for sharing those with everyone. And thank you all for sharing your concerns that you have. I know that it can be difficult to share such concerns when you really do want to help. And I think it's important that we surface these so you can get additional information to allow you to work through these concerns and still be able to provide services to those who most need your assistance. As we continue through today's webinar, please do not hesitate to submit questions in the chat box that you want discussed at the end of the webinar. We have reserved time to answer your questions, and Leah will also ask me some of your questions throughout the presentation. So, who is incarcerated? I'm sure you have heard news reports about the high rates of incarceration in the US. Those stories are true, and this slide breaks down where people are held. There are lots of different types of confinement facilities, and I think it's helpful to understand the differences between a prison and a jail. A jail is usually operated by county or city government, although some states run a jail system. When people are arrested, they are brought to a jail where they will be released on bail or will be held until a trial date. After someone is convicted for a misdemeanor or low-level offense with a sentence typically of a year or less, although this time frame varies by jurisdiction, they will stay at the jail to serve their time. This means that jails deal with a revolving door of people. Jails, in comparison with prisons, tend to be more chaotic given the rapid movement of people in and out each and every day. Keep in mind that jails hold people charged with a range of offenses. For example, someone could be at the jail for public intoxication while someone else could be there for assault or worse. Jails may also contract with the state or federal government to hold inmates for a specific period of time or while they are being transported elsewhere. In comparison, prisons are operated by the state or federal government and hold people who have been convicted of a crime with a sentence of a year or longer. Prisons are typically classified by their security level, minimum to maximum, which is usually determined by the severity of the crime that someone has committed. Some prisons have multiple security levels, while others might just have one. Given the longer lengths of stay, prisons often have more work and programming opportunities than jails. On this slide, there is an other category, and this includes jails and prisons in Indian country, military prisons, and civil commitment facilities. When you add up the numbers from the previous slide, the results are staggering. There are over 2.2 million adults and 70,000 youth incarcerated in facilities across the U.S. at any given time. And while we saw on the previous slide that prisons hold the most people at any given time, it is estimated that over 12 million people pass through our nation's jails every year. That number is astounding to me. But like we saw on the previous slide, the vast majority of people held in jails have not been convicted of a crime. Because of this, the actual number of people who pass through the criminal justice system every year is much higher than the incarcerated population on any given day. When I first started working on PREA, I read a report, a piece of which has stuck with me nearly 12 years later. It is the reality that the majority of people, about 95%, who pass through the criminal justice system will be released and returned to our communities. This includes people who are sentenced for a crime and serve out their time. It gave me pause to think of individuals and how they are treated while in confinement and the long-term impact that treatment may have on their lives, as well as the impact that treatment will have on their families and communities. Unfortunately, given our high rates of incarceration, the number of people who have experienced sexual abuse while in a detention setting is also alarming. According to an estimate by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, or BJS, roughly 200,000 people are sexually abused in U.S. prisons and jails each year. Note that this figure represents the number of people, not incidents. Many of these 200,000 people were abused more than once. To get to these numbers, BJS conducted a review of administrative records on reported incidents of sexual abuse, as well as surveys of inmates in prisons and jails and residents in juvenile detention facilities. The last inmate surveys were conducted in 2012. BJS is in the process of conducting new surveys, and in the next couple of years, reports will be released providing updated statistics on sexual victimization in juvenile detention, prisons, and jails. While we talk about survivors of sexual abuse in detention, who are we exactly talking about? They are mothers, students, elders, fathers, workers, children, friends, and siblings. Prisoners have the right to be safe from sexual abuse, and if you do know an incarcerated survivor, their safety matters to you and to all of us. Remember earlier that I said most incarcerated people are released and returned to our communities. The same is true for incarcerated survivors. These are just a few of the faces of people who have experienced sexual abuse in detention. Let's dig a little deeper into who is incarcerated in the U.S. We already know the numbers. Now let's look at who those numbers represent. Mass incarceration has had a damaging and disproportionate effect on communities of color and low-income communities. More than 60% of the people in prison today are people of color. Roughly 60% of the people in federal prisons are there for drug, often nonviolent and low-level, not the kind of so-called, drug kingpins, and for immigration-related offenses. Among all incarcerated men and women, more than half are parents. 1 in 43 minor children has a parent in prison. And more than half of all prison and jail inmates have a mental health problem, making prisons and jails default mental health facilities. There are many more men than women who are incarcerated. Roughly 93% of U.S. federal prisoners are men. While the total number of people in detention has grown tremendously since the 1980s by approximately 500%, the increase in the numbers of women has actually outpaced that of men. In fact, the numbers of women in custody has grown by more than 700% in that same period of time. Fortunately, the overall number of people behind bars in the U.S. has decreased slightly in the past several years, but we still have a long way to go. As was just mentioned, men of color are incarcerated at much higher rates than their white peers. Let's take a look at what that means. Black men are 6 times and Latino men are 2.5 times more likely to be in prison than white men. If current trends of incarceration continue, 1 in 3 Black men born today can expect to spend time in prison during his lifetime. Women of color are incarcerated at much higher rates than white women, with Black women being locked up at higher rates than Latino women, who are in turn locked up at higher rates than white women. Native Americans are incarcerated at a rate 38% higher than the national average, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics. Native American youth are 3 times as likely as white youth to be held in a juvenile detention facility. And if we look at a comparison of the racial makeup of the U.S. as compared to the population that is incarcerated, we would see that Black and Latino people make up a highly disproportionate percentage of the prison population. We've shared a lot of information about who is incarcerated, and I want to take a minute to say a little bit more about female prisoners. There are over 200,000 women behind bars in America, many of whom are mothers and victims of prior sexual and/or domestic abuse. Women who have committed such crimes typically average 15-year sentences. In contrast, their male counterparts, who are less likely to have used a weapon, are given more lenient sentences of between 2 and 6 years. 80% of women in jails are mothers, and incarceration can lead to isolation and trauma for their children who are left behind. Even worse, many states still shackle women during labor and even while giving birth. I would now like to introduce you to Nicole De La Torre and Troy Isaac. Nicole De La Torre is a Senior Program Officer at JDI's Washington, D.C. office. As a member of the Domestic Programs team, Nicole assists with providing training and technical assistance to corrections agencies, supporting their implementation of the Prison Rape Elimination Act standards. Troy Isaac is a survivor of sexual abuse in juvenile detention and adult correctional facilities, and is a member of JDI's Survivor Council. He is an advocate for victims of sexual abuse behind bars, and his story has been featured in the New York Times, Huffington Post, Washington Post, and the New York Review of Books. He has also shared his story as part of a congressional briefing on PREA on Capitol Hill. Currently, Troy is working as a caregiver. He is also the founder and director of Troy's Project for Humanity, through which he frequently collaborates with the LAPD and youth groups in the Los Angeles area, and is involved in numerous efforts to protect and promote the rights of vulnerable populations, including LGBTQ, homeless, and disabled people. We hope that hearing about Troy's experience can give you a better understanding of the impact your involvement can have on incarcerated survivors. Welcome, Nicole and Troy.
Thanks so much, Tara, and thanks for introducing us. So Troy, I think it would be really great before we get started, if you could share with our listeners a little bit more about your experience in detention and why you joined JDI Survivor Council.
Good afternoon, fellow advocates. I first would like to say that I appreciate the comments that are coming in. I believe that so many people that are incarcerated would definitely love hearing you and being with you. I was at the age of 12 when I was sexually abused by young gang members in juvenile hall. I later was sexually abused by adult inmates in California state prisons, which I served about 24 years. Harassment by staff, including gang members in adult prisons, for being openly gender non-conforming.
Thanks, Troy. So let's sort of dig into some of the stuff we've been talking about today. Can you tell us a little bit about what services were available to you while you were in these juvenile facilities as well as in the adult prisons?
There was no services available for me. The Prison Rape Elimination Act wasn't in place at the time. No outside support services were available. In the facilities, there was mental health. However, they were incompetent and not really willing to assist or help me. I reported the abuse to staff many times, but none of them would help. They blamed me because I was different. There really wasn't anyone I could talk to during all of those years except Albie Estrada. He was a staff member when I was 12 years old, and I didn't know it at the time, but he was gay, and he is my friend to this day, which is a beautiful thing. And this is why I'm involved in the work now. I know the need kids and adults have for comprehensive support services. And I am so glad PREA made this a fight, a requirement for all facilities. I joined JDI Survivor Council because I want to fight for the better rights for people in similar situations to mine. No one, and I really mean it, no one should go through what I went through.
Yeah, thanks for sharing your personal experience, Troy. We know that can be really difficult, so we really appreciate your honesty. So what do you think are some things that advocates should know about working with incarcerated survivors?
That it's not scary, that the majority of the inmates, in prisons or in juvenile halls, they're just trying to do their time. They're trying to do their time and they're trying to get out without any difficulties. And we have such little support behind bars, we need outside advocates we can trust and talk to openly. I think any victim you meet within a facility is more likely to treat you with respect and appreciation than anything else.
Great. And what about some of the logistics? Like, what might be helpful for advocates to know beforehand about providing services?
Well, if you are providing services by phone, remember that the phones are usually in a common area, so it's probably going to be loud. Inmates may have concerns around privacy. Also, many facilities will have time limits on the calls, so it's a good idea to plan around that. Otherwise, whether it's on the phone or in person, I'd say treat it as you would if you were helping someone in the community. We just want to talk to someone who will listen, who will believe us and just be there for us.
Yeah, those are some really great points, Troy. I'll also add that JDI has an advocate's manual that provides additional information about providing support services and how to safety plan with victims who are incarcerated. We'll provide that information on how to find it online at the end of the webinar. But back to you, Troy. Can you address some concerns that advocates may have around being in a prison or jail as a service provider? And some of these I'm sure you've heard, and also some folks mentioned a few earlier in the webinar. So yeah, could you address some of those concerns?
Well, first, you should be prepared to go through security. Like you're at an airport, because they want to check you, they want to pat you down, they want to make sure you don't have anything illegal going into the detention facility. Folks from the outside are rarely taken into the housing units. So you'll probably meet with clients somewhere in the administrative buildings or the visiting areas. As you can probably imagine, your meetings will be less private, and there's likely going to be an officer nearby at all times. And I would just, suggest, focusing in on the survivor of the situation, just keenly, dialing in to him or her.
Great, those are really important things to flag. And I can also just mention a couple of things from my experience as a visitor at different facilities. You should definitely ask your contacts about dress code before you go to facility. For example, some might ask you not to wear a specific color or use open-toed shoes. And then you should also ask them what you can bring into the facility. Usually cell phones and other personal items are not allowed. In fact, before you even start providing services, you should ask your contact at the facility for a visit so that you can see what it's like, to go through security and enter the facility. And honestly, most agencies that we've worked with have been more than willing to give us a tour. And then I did want to mention something else, and this is a little bit less about going in as an advocate, but Troy did mention being pat searched to enter, that you would be pat searched. So I wanted to point out that your clients will most likely also be pat searched after a meeting with you. In fact, we have provided technical assistance to advocates who were concerned because their incarcerated clients were being strip searched before or after individual or group counseling sessions. And so as advocates, you can imagine how a strip search can be really harmful for a victim of sexual abuse. So I find it helpful to just keep that in mind and to remember or to remind myself that it truly takes a lot of courage for incarcerated victims to seek this type of support. And as an additional, if you do become aware of incarcerated survivors being strip searched in connection with you providing them services, please do reach out to us or your state coalition because it's really not appropriate, and there are maybe some advocacy that we can collaborate with you on to address it. So great. Troy, is there anything else you think would be helpful for advocates to know?
Yes, I would like to say that in customer service, the customer is always right. With victims and survivors of sexual abuse, they are always right. And there may be officers, counselors that will try to dissuade you and will try to tell you that, these people are crying wolf and don't believe them. Just always believe the survivor.
Great. Thank you so much, Troy. We hope that by hearing Troy today that you have a little bit of a less scary picture of who you'll be working with. And Troy will also be around for the Q&A session. So if folks have any other questions for him, I think he'd be happy to answer them. So thanks again, Troy, for joining us today and for all the work that you're doing. We really appreciate you being on the webinar today.
Thank you so much.
Back to you, Tara.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Nicole and Troy, for sharing that important information today. Troy, I really appreciate your continued advocacy to eliminate sexual abuse and confinement, and I'm so grateful for your willingness to share advice for how to provide services to incarcerated survivors. So let's take a minute to reflect on the conversation we just heard between Nicole and Troy. Please share with the group thoughts you have about what similarities and differences exist between incarcerated survivors and survivors in the community. Like before, you can put your comments in the chat box.
All right. So someone wrote, not being believed. Feelings of embarrassment. The trauma. Triggers and not being believed. Extreme isolation. Targeting gender non-conforming individuals with victim blaming. Safety. Victim blaming. Feelings of shame. They are all seeking safety. Not having support. Traumatization, shame, not taken seriously. The need to be heard and validated. Being shamed and not believed. Increased trauma. Shame. Trauma is trauma, not being believed. Confrontation. The power of the impact on victim of the person who did believe.
Great. Thank you all for those. And you're right. I mean, there are some differences. But many of those, but there's a lot of similarities, and any differences are, again, not about who the person is. Rather, it's where they live that differs greatly and impacts their ability to heal. For example, all survivors may have feeling of self-blame or fear, or many of the other numerous things that you all have shared today. Incarceration presents obstacles to healing that survivors in the community do not face. For example, incarcerated survivors may have only a limited ability to seek out support or have to exchange letters as a means, as a primary means of communication. Or like Troy shared, even if they can contact you by phone, they may not have a lot of privacy for these calls and may not be able to speak for long. Like we talked about earlier, entering a correctional facility for the first time or working with inmates either in person or remotely may raise some concerns. Here are things to keep in mind when working with inmates. Remember, think about people who you serve in the community. You do not know their entire history. This is also true of working with inmate survivors. You likely will not know their criminal background, but remember to focus on their needs as a survivor and their needs in that moment. Get to know the facility before you provide services. Even if you will only be talking with people over the phone or through letters, go take a tour of the facility, see what the facility looks like, and meet with staff and inmates. This will help you as you work with incarcerated survivors to understand the context of where they live when working with them. And sit down and meet with the facility officials in person as you discuss the parameters of your collaboration in order to build a stronger working relationship and help the officials to understand who you are. Also, though they may not be able to take you up on it, invite your facility contacts to come to your offices to better understand the work and professionalism of your program. In addition to the recommendations from Nicole and Troy, if you will provide in-person services, talk with the facility staff to learn where you will work when providing services, and ask any questions you have, including how safety and security will be handled when you are there. Also know that corrections facilities count upon rules and hierarchies to maintain order and safety, so it is important for anyone entering the facility to be informed of the rules. Learn the facility policies and protocols about visitors and community volunteers. You should consider yourself a guest of the agency and respect all safety rules and visitor guidelines, even if they seem overly restrictive. Adopting a survivor-centered approach to sexual abuse will be a new concept for most corrections facilities, and the same goes for working with rape crisis centers. Maintaining your core advocacy principles while remaining flexible will enable you to provide incarcerated survivors with the support that they need. And don't forget that rape crisis centers have a commitment to serving their communities, and incarcerated survivors are part of that community. I want to highlight a few things to keep in mind additional things to keep in mind when working with incarcerated survivors. Maintain confidentiality. Always be clear about your limits and exceptions. If your organization has not already discussed with this facility, I strongly encourage you to do so before starting services. It is important that all parties understand what you mean by confidentiality and what limitations the facility may request to maintain safety and security. These may include anyone telling you that they plan to harm themselves, hurt someone else, or plan to escape. You should also discuss with the facility what you will do if you receive a report of sexual abuse. Some facilities will want you to report that to them so they can investigate, and you will need to explain your obligation to maintain confidentiality and that you are not able to disclose this information. However, that you will share with the survivor different reporting options. So be sure to find out from the facility what the different options are so you can tell the survivor. JDI and the Resource Sharing Project have a lot of resources to help you in working with incarcerated survivors, and we will share more about these at the end of the webinar. If your organization has not already done so, an MOU or Memorandum of Understanding is a great way to set expectations for both parties, especially related to confidentiality. And a side note about confidentiality, I think it's really important to tease apart what you mean by confidential. I've heard experiences where both corrections and advocates were saying confidential and everyone thought they were in agreement, but when they really got to working together, they realized they meant different things. It's also important to share with the incarcerated survivor the limits to confidentiality when you provide services. Also, decide in advance how to handle challenging requests for services. For example, non-English speaking survivors or working with the perpetrator of a client from the community who may have been sexually abused in the jail. Be prepared to overcome resistance and disruption in services, especially if the program is new or not well known. Jails are transient environments. You never know how long you will have with a client. It is not uncommon to encounter obstacles to meeting with an inmate, even if your visit is planned. They may have an appointment off-site or a court hearing. There may be a facility-wide lockdown or other change to the daily operations. They may even be transferred to another facility. If you travel a long distance to meet with someone in person, ask the facility to call in advance, or you can call them before departing to make sure the appointment is still scheduled. Of course, things do come up last minute, even if you have confirmed the visit. People in custody are used to being judged by others. Most prisoners are very aware that some people see them as less than human. The experience of being seen as an inmate first and a person second means that interactions with a kind outsider take on incredible importance. When a prisoner gets to speak with an outsider, he or she will often be very eager to talk about life before prison, who they were, degrees they earned, or jobs they had. For many advocates, this might seem like too much information or a waste of time, but it is significant for the survivor to show that they are a whole person and to get you to see past the prison jumpsuit. Be patient. People in detention may be hesitant to open up with you at first. They may doubt your services are confidential, think that you are somehow affiliated with or work for the facility, that they will not get in trouble for talking with you, or that they may get in trouble for talking with you, and that you even that you care about their well-being. Prisoners are also so unused to having privacy, they may be unaccustomed to speaking with the expectation that information will remain private. It is also important to allow for more time to build rapport into sessions than you might with survivors in the community. If it's helpful, use the examples of an attorney to give the client an understanding that you are a credentialed professional with comparable confidentiality protections that are applicable to conversations with their lawyer. The best way to earn the trust of a survivor is to be kind, consistent, and persistent. Prisoners are used to well-meaning outsiders making promises, then disappearing. Be careful to be clear about what you can and cannot provide, and to communicate if plans fall through or need to change. Be clear about your role and explicit about professional boundaries. Staff may be confused about your role and may give the wrong information to prisoners. Given the limited opportunities to talk to outsiders, recognize that incarcerated survivors may ask for help with issues unrelated to sexual abuse. Expect to have to be clear and firm about what services your organization provides from the outset to help manage expectations early on and to avoid damaging the trust survivors have in you and the program. Show respect for the survivor. I have spoken with some advocates who have been challenged when they learn of a survivor's criminal history, especially if they were also a perpetrator of violence. Keep in mind that now they are also a survivor and need your assistance. Like we mentioned above, you may not know their criminal history, but if you do, unless it is relevant to the services you are providing, avoid discussing this part of their background. You will likely need to adapt interventions to the corrections environment. This is another reason why taking a tour can be valuable. You can start thinking about how to make these adaptations even before you meet with a survivor. This is a quote from an advocate we work with in California. I recently had a conversation with another advocate who provides phone services in the southern US to incarcerated survivors. And she said that while the phone number does not show up indicating that it's someone from the prison, they know immediately when it is an inmate because of the noise in the background, something that Troy also mentioned, which is different from what they usually experience talking with survivors. Advocates can play a vital role in empowering survivors of sexual violence, even survivors who are incarcerated. Prison life is so difficult for survivors that advocates can make a huge difference through simple actions, whether through their physical presence at the facility or by responding to calls and letters from incarcerated survivors. Many survivors of sexual abuse in detention are also survivors of sexual abuse in the community who may never have received any support or help, underscoring why access to services in detention is so vital. Not only do people need to heal from their own experiences, there are inmates who will learn of a family member or loved one who has been sexually assaulted while they themselves are in confinement. This may cause the inmate to experience a range of feelings and the need for support while they are separated from their loved one who is healing from this experience. This is an opportunity to share how they can support their loved one and how their loved one can get support from community resources. Like I've said before, most incarcerated survivors are released, bringing all of their trauma back to their communities. If they can get help while on the inside, they are more likely to be healthy when they leave. You are the experts in helping survivors to heal. Incarcerated survivors, like survivors in the community, rely on quality services to heal. Here are some quotes from people that we work with. Tom Cahill is a prison rape survivor and a former president of JDI. He said, "I used to feel shame and humiliation about what happened to me in that Texas jail. Eventually, I came to realize that it was not my shame, it was my country's shame. And while we continue to work to eradicate sexual abuse in detention, we need you as advocates to help survivors to realize that the abuse wasn't their fault and that there is hope." I think this quote from Kalinda speaks to the importance of seeing them as survivors and not of victims. She says, "I want people to know that I am the face of a prison rape survivor, not a prison rape victim." Thank you for the work that you do in your role as an advocate. Your services are so critically important to all survivors, including those who experience sexual abuse while incarcerated. I know that we offered to have some questions throughout, but you all, I don't know that we got any. Did we, Leah?
Sorry, just unmuting myself. No, we did not. But I'm really glad that we created so much time for you all to be able to start to think about what questions you have that you would like to hear from me, the least experienced person on this call, or JDI, who has so much wonderful things to share, or Troy, who is a survivor himself. So I'm so glad that we have so much time here at the end to actually really dig into what questions you folks might have. Okay, we have our first question. So someone asked, how willing are facilities to allow advocates access to survivors?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll talk from my experience, but I encourage Troy and Nicole to jump in as well. I think facilities are willing, and I think that willingness is continuing, is growing every day. I think, as we talked about before, in terms of the numbers of people who are incarcerated, and especially the numbers of people who have a mental illness, facilities are really strapped to provide adequate services to people in their care and custody. So someone coming in willing to offer services, whether it be by phone or mail or even in person, whether it be one-on-one or groups, I think they're open to that possibility. Like we shared earlier, I think it's really important to do relationship building. And to go in and meet people at the facility, show that you're interested in learning about the facility, and talk about the kinds of services and ways that you can work collaboratively to provide services to incarcerated survivors. Nicole or Troy?
I think that there are some prisons that don't want you there. And I think that it comes with the level of the prison. So if you're dealing with, for instance, at Corcoran State Prison, if you're dealing like Charlie Manson's there, Sirhan was there. Those are people that I used to be around sometimes. So it's hard, for advocates to get into those situations like that. However, they're going to have to let you in. But sometimes they're going to be a little reluctant depending on the level of the prison that you're dealing with. Women prisons are probably more easier than men prisons.
Yeah, thank you, Trey. I would agree with all that you said. And I think, you know, getting in, you know, again, can be a variety of different things. So while you may face resistance meeting people one-on-one, in person at a facility, you know, maybe you're able to talk with them on a phone. You know, I work with the South Carolina Department of Corrections, for example, has agreements with rape crisis organizations across the state. And so there's actually a hotline number that inmates can dial to talk directly with an advocate, or being provided a mailing address. The PREA standards actually can help in this manner. One of the standards actually requires that incarcerated survivors have access to confidential support services, and that those confidential support services can be used for, you know, not just for abuse that they may have experienced while they were incarcerated, but at any time in their lives. And it says about how it doesn't say that it has to be any one way, but there, you know, has to be some way that they can get in touch with you.
Okay, we have gotten a number of questions.
I can see that. That's good.
So the first one I'm going to ask is, how does an inmate initiate services?
Great. So I think that can really vary depending on the kind of service. So like I mentioned, maybe the services are provided by mail. So the barrier then becomes, how do they access that address? And you know, a little bit of what we've said before, you know, people may not want others to know that they're seeking out these services. So just having a standalone poster on a wall, and that's the only information on it, is going to be, people aren't going to be willing to walk up to it to write down the mailing address. So, you know, the information for how to contact you needs to be available in discreet locations. You know, maybe it's next to the microwave in the day room that the inmates, you know, warm up their food, or maybe there are posters in the medical unit. Maybe the information is posted in the inmate handbook. It should be available a lot of different ways. So like I said, it could be by mail. If it's a phone number, it needs to be a phone number that they don't have to get enter an inmate PIN or otherwise disclose who they are. Because again, it's supposed to be provided as confidential as possible. So if they have to use an inmate phone and then enter their inmate PIN, then the facility is going to know who's calling you. So there are certainly ways, and the phone vendors that serve prisons can certainly set it up so they don't have to access you that way. There are other options now as well, like that inmates may have a tablet or may have a kiosk where they can order commissary items or submit other kinds of notes to people. You know, it's possible to get on an approved list so every inmate is able to send an email to the Rape Crisis Center. So that's another option. Or it could be about actually getting services in person. And so, you know, in terms of getting services in person, I've heard advocates describe that they are just at the facility, say every Friday, and they're available. And they start building relationships with mental health and medical, so those referrals can be made to them. It's also possible that if someone contacts you, say via phone or mail, that if they disclose their name and are asking to meet with you in person, that you could then go to the facility and then ask to meet with that person. Obviously, when you meet in person, more people are going to know but they aren't going to, you know, that they're meeting with you, but they are not going to know the nature of the conversation or those details. Nicole, any other thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of mentioned the standards earlier, but within that requirement, the standards actually say that the facility is responsible for providing addresses and, to the extent possible or available, hotline numbers. So when Tara was talking about those posters and stuff, that's not necessarily just to clarify that you all have to to do that. The facility should be doing that. Um, and then the other point I wanted to make, which is it's less common, but it does happen in terms of initiating services, is that a lot of inmates, the first interaction they have with advocates is actually at the hospital. The same way that a hospital might call a rape crisis center when someone from the community comes in for a rape kit, they will also, in a lot of cases, hopefully, call an advocate when an inmate is taken to the hospital for a rape kit. So we have heard from some folks that that's how they start their relationship with advocates. So I just wanted to mention that.
Great, thanks, Nicole.
I think just sort of as a follow-up to that question, we received this. How do you maintain confidentiality if responding to an initial letter received by an inmate? I've been told all letters or mail are reviewed by corrections officers before an inmate receives them.
I would like to respond to that.
Sure, Trey, go ahead.
Sure. I mean, when I was writing letters to JDI, before, JDI used to be named Stop Prisoner Rape. So Cynthia Totten, which is now the deputy director in Washington, she's still an attorney, but I could write to her confidentially because she was an attorney. So if there is anyone that has, ESQ, we don't have to have you can be confidential and you can get the letter out the institution without them knowing what you're saying.
Yeah, thank you for that, Trey. That's absolutely a way that can happen. And legal mail coming in is not, and as I understand it, is not opened by staff. Now, the letter may be opened in front of someone. An inmate may have to open the letter, but they don't have to share the information because of the nature of the communication. Even if there isn't someone on staff that is an attorney for those kinds of confidential communication, it's another example of why it's important to build relationships with the facility. I've certainly, and that can be part of an MOU, right? That it's, so it's not just a verbal agreement, but it's written down that any letters that inmates may send to your address won't be opened by the mailroom. And vice versa, if there's any mail coming in with that address, that those wouldn't be opened as well, that they'd be treated similar to attorney letters coming in for the individual. It's not a fail-safe method, to be sure, but I think that it's something that can, with time, is something that can happen.
I also want to encourage folks to reach out to your coalition in your state and to have some of these conversations. I know there are state coalitions who have, on behalf of all of the programs across the state, been able to negotiate with DOJ to actually create a mechanism for advocates to communicate by letters to incarcerated survivors and to not have those letters read. I believe that's Washington State. And other coalitions that maybe, because most likely your programs don't have an attorney on staff, bummer, but a lot of times state coalitions do. So I know that there are other coalitions who've also used their legal standing at the coalition to help fund the letters to and from programs. So reach out to your coalition and figure out sort of what creative moves you guys can make together to make this work for incarcerated folks in your service area.
That's great.
And Leah, I just wanted to add one quick other note, and this is less about the content of the letters and confidentiality in that sense, but going back to sort of the envelopes. One thing that I've heard of some centers doing so that the inmates feel more comfortable mailing letters is they might change their name, because of course, like if your name is the Rape Crisis Center of Washington, D.C., that sort of, even if someone's not opening the mail, it's kind of obvious what it's about. Mm-hmm. So a lot of centers might use like the acronym for their organization, or even just, not put the name and just put the address. So that's also just a quick note. And again, that's something that you can include in your MOU when you, when you develop that with your agencies. Like several rape crisis centers that we've worked with had the name, had the word women in their name, like Women's Resource Center, or, and that's something else that they decided, like, let's not include that because, we're serving, our mission is now broader, and we are working with men, especially when we talk about incarcerated survivors. So that's also something that they tweaked a little bit so it didn't have that. But again, those are all small things that can help inmates feel more comfortable reaching out to you guys.
Thank you. This question, this is like quiz time. I don't know if you guys are gonna know the answer off the top of your heads, but when you said whether or not there were more sexual assaults in male or female prisons or facilities, and then also, do you have that same information in regards to juvenile facilities?
Yeah, it is a test question. So the person, and Nicole, check me on this. So
yeah, I can.
The rates are, I think it's about 4.2% of men, and I think it's 10%.
I can open the BJS report while we talk if you want to.
Thank you. I think sorry, I don't have, because I'm sharing my. Yeah, since I'm sharing my screen, I can't. It's roughly, it's closer to the like 8 to 10% for juveniles. And what's interesting to note about adults is that it's pretty equally divided between staff as the perpetrators of the sexual abuse and other inmates as the perpetrators. The disparity is actually with juveniles, and especially with juvenile males. So juvenile males are, I think it's sort of like 60% or 70% are, or maybe slightly higher than that, are sexually abused by staff, female staff in particular, as opposed to other residents, and then it's sort of the reverse for female residents. So female juveniles in a juvenile setting, they are they're more likely to be sexually abused by fellow residents. Yeah, and I do have
the adult one open.
Go ahead.
I just have the adult one open, so I can just real quickly mention, so for when we talk about inmate on inmate sexual abuse, the rate for men is 1.7%, and for women it's 7.2%. So much higher abuse amongst women, amongst the inmate population. And then when we talk about staff sexual abuse, the male rate is 2.4 at male facilities, and then for women it's 2.4. So it's about, it's actually the same. So the disparity is when we talk about inmate on inmate.
But then, of course, when we think about how many more men are incarcerated, a higher percentage. It sounds like a higher percentage of women are survivors, but there's vastly more male survivors to serve.
Correct.
Right, that's correct. And just to let people know, this data that I just shared is the sexual victimization in prisons and jails reported by inmates. This is anonymous surveys that were conducted by the Bureau of Justice Statistics under the Department of Justice, and they're available online. We're happy to share the link through Leah, or actually, I guess I can just share it on the chat. Oh, this is so fun. Sorry.
Yeah, and so I see a follow-up question here about rate for trans folks, and this is actually fairly complicated. Quite honestly, because, so first of all, a reminder that the last time they did these surveys was in 2012. And every year they kind of go back through the data and try to see like additional like analysis that they can do to provide more information. And so, like I mentioned earlier, they are in the process. They're doing data collection for the new juvenile survey now. Next year will be prisons, and the year after that, jail. So, and then it takes about a year to get any reports out. So hopefully soon we'll have some updated, in the next few years, have some updated information. But in terms of the trans folks, they went back and looked to see what they knew, what data they had about transgender individuals. And there really wasn't a lot of power. They actually had to combine all the surveys that they had done, both prisons and jails. And at the end of the day, they could only really come out and say anything about transgender women in male facilities. And I believe the rate was something like 38% of them had experienced sexual abuse in confinement. So 38% as compared to, what was it, like 1.4 and 2.4 of males. There's a huge disparity in the, and they are significantly at higher risk of being victimized as women being, transgender women being housed at a male facility. But that's about all we know at this point.
And I just shared the
adult
report that I mentioned, the youth one, and the supplement for transgender adults.
Thanks, Nicole.
Okay, here's another question. Can you talk about some of the terms you use to refer to incarcerated survivors and how you decide which ones to use? Our partners in corrections have moved away from the term inmate to the term offender.
It really, that's a tough question, only because I feel like it really depends on the jurisdiction, what they call people. Prisons and jails tend to refer to people as inmates, offenders, prisoners. Community confinement facilities and juvenile facilities tend to refer to people as residents. Community confinement might also refer to them as clients. So, when I'm actually talking with inmates, I call them by their name, as I'm sure you all would as advocates. But one thing actually to think about is, I think you should ask the facility how they refer to individuals in their custody, and also ask them how they address people. A lot of times they use inmate or offender or resident and then the person's last name. So I don't call people, inmate Smith. I might call them Mr. Smith, but I don't, if the standard practice is to use last names, I tend to do that as well, but just use, Mr. Ms., that sort of thing. Nicole, thoughts from you?
Yeah, no, I think it really does depend on the jurisdiction, like you said. And I mean, we at JDI, we've had to change whole trainings where we use the word inmate to offender or whatever it is the agency uses. But I think what you use when you're talking to the staff is one thing, and as Sarah mentioned, you don't have to use that term when you're talking to the survivors. In fact, you probably shouldn't. I think, as Joe said, I think you referenced Joe in your talking points, Sarah, that just being referred to by his name instead of inmate number was so powerful to him. So, I think you would refer to your clients the same way that you would in the community, by their last name or by their first name, or just saying, when you referring to them as clients, as men and women. I think that's what I would suggest.
Yeah, and actually to kind of piggyback on that, it's similar, is around kind of the touching, like, are you able to touch someone or shake their hand or give them a hug? I mean, these are things that you would definitely want to talk with the facility about. So, for example, in male facilities that I work with, I always ask beforehand, but it's generally okay for me to shake someone's hand. And that's the extent of my kind of physical interaction with them. And in a female facility, and again, I always ask because there's often, prohibitions around hugging, but I have, especially in one facility I work at, and I work closely with a specific group of inmates, they do allow me to give the women a hug. And, I can tell from that how powerful that is for the women who are receiving the hug. And I'm also really appreciative of the facility and allowing that exchange to happen. Because you can kind of tell the inmates the first time were a little bit hesitant. But I said, no, I asked and it's okay. And I had, someone from the security there as well saying, no, it's okay. And, but that went a long way.
It also depends. It depends on the level of the survivor. It depends
Mm,
on the level of prison that the advocates are dealing with.
Mhm.
Because there are going to be times where you're not going to be shaking anybody's hand. I mean, in
yeah.
California state prisons for men in higher levels, there's no shaking hands. You know, it's all about,
Hmm.
it's all about you can talk to the person, but you're not shaking the hands. And sometimes they're handcuffed and
Mm.
they're not released. So it just depends on the situation.
Yeah.
The next question we have is, do you think that it is possible and appropriate to have a support group in prison? And I'm very excited to hear all of your answers, but my very short answer is, heck yes.
Heck
I would
yes!
echo that. You know what? Can I tell you something honestly? No, absolutely. Heck yes. So, and I have a perfect example of this. So, like I mentioned, in South Carolina, one of the advocates, um, she's a female, and we're going into a male facility. And so she has actually started holding support groups in the facility. And she's only done one so far, and she wants to expand it. And so the work that I do at the facility, we work with the inmate leaders. It's almost, it's easiest for me to liken it to sort of like student council. Like an inmate, they have elections, and people are elected from their housing units to represent the inmate population. And so she suggested to them, like, well, could I run one of these groups with you all so you can see what it's like, and then you can go back and share with the rest of the inmates what it's like, and then those people who are interested can come and participate. So that has been very well received, and I think from her perspective it actually has been a way to gain entree um, to identifying individuals who might want to meet with her individually. And she's able to build rapport, and people get to know who she is and what she's about in a group setting before they step forward in a much more vulnerable way to receive one-on-one services.
And I'll just add to that, this is Nicole, add to that, that it might also be kind of an easy way in for you in terms of the facility itself. Like I think a lot of advocates that we've heard from that are doing one-on-one in-person services now started by doing groups. I think some facilities might be more more open to that, or just it might just be easier for them to start with groups. So yeah, it's a great option.
As someone who is like obsessed with support groups and like a very big passion of mine in this work, I think that really when I talk to rural programs, I've actually found that the rural programs honestly have more success in creating a support group within the prison than they've found creating a support group out in the community. Because like we've talked about a lot on this webinar already, incarcerated survivors are just so isolated and such in desperate need of the support. Often folks are housed in facilities far away from any family or peer support that they might have. And so a support group is one of the only means that they have for connection and camaraderie and support and empathy. Whereas in the larger community, yes, a support group can serve those functions, but often folks still have family, community, friends, other folks to lean on. So I definitely say go forth and build a support group. The next question we have is, what is the biggest barrier systemic racism poses to incarcerated survivors of color in accessing services?
Wow. I'm not sure how to answer that one. Yeah, wow. I that's a great question, and I honestly, off the top of my head, I'm not sure I have a great answer for you. Nicole or Troy, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I can say this. When I was trying to get services from the Gay and Lesbian Center, I didn't get those services. And do I think that I didn't get those services because I was Black? Yes. And I got services from Stop Prisoner Rape.
Mm.
And that was the only organization that I got services from. So yes, I do believe that certain situations, race plays a factor. Because if I was white, the Gay and Lesbian Center would have probably pulled me in with all arms to try to help me.
I think that's fair. That was the first thought that really came to my mind when I was wrestling with this question, is that I think more than anything, it's the inherent systemic racism that honestly is built into the advocacy organizations, even joining us on the webinar today, that part of the reason I think programs struggle to view detention facilities as part of their service area is not just because we marginalize incarcerated survivors, but because so many of the folks that are incarcerated are Black and brown people, are communities of color. And so oftentimes our programs, particularly in rural areas, are created in communities and that have inherent systemic racism built in. And so often our programs are largely made up of white folks on staff, white folks as volunteers, white folks as our board of directors. And so that does build itself into the fabric of our organizations, and impacts our politics and the services that we provide. And so I'm grateful that someone asked the question, that we have to always be bringing that to the forefront as we're thinking about how we serve our whole community.
Yeah, thank you both, Trey and Leah, for those thoughts.
The next question that we received is, one of the ways we build relationships with our communities is to host workshops at different organizations depending on the population. Are there any types of workshops a rape crisis center could host at a prison that would be helpful for inmates and help us build relationships within the prison?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I'm as you start talking, Leah, the first I thought, oh my gosh, why haven't we said this yet? So PREA has really kind of thrown correctional facilities for a loop in a lot of ways. And even though the standards have been out for a long time, there are a lot of available resources. Some facilities, many facilities, are still struggling with various aspects, if not all of the standards. And you all as advocates could come in and help do training on dynamics of sexual abuse, on trauma-informed care, the impact on trauma on people. Heck, even thinking about investigators and really driving home, kind of like how trauma impacts the brain, and things like that someone who's experienced trauma may not recall things in a linear fashion, or may recall things in bits and pieces. I think you absolutely could be a resource to the staff at the facility or the agency and holding trainings, and I think it could go a long way in terms of building the relationship, because I think it also demonstrates the I always look at collaborations as sort of a two-way street, right? And so coming in as an advocate and asking to meet with, clients, incarcerated clients, you're kind of asking something of the facility. But if you could also in turn give back by offering to do trainings of staff, and you could even do some of those similar kinds of education pieces with the inmates as well, that's then taking a load off of them in a very stressed, short-staffed, kind of environment. So I think that's absolutely an opportunity that you could provide.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, in terms of working with the inmate population, I mean, we just talked about support groups, but you can also do these types of workshops. I mean, we've heard from many advocates who do like healthy relationship workshops or workshops around relationship violence, or even, this might be a little bit more controversial at the facility, but safe sex, and just even parenting. I mean, I guess it depends on how broad your mission is at your organization, but all these kinds of workshops are great ways to get involved with the inmate population and the facility.
So we only have 10 minutes left together, and we do have a few slides where we walk you through the resources that JDI has available, but we have 2 quick questions left before we get to those slides. So,
okay.
Thank you for describing these different settings. I just keep wondering, do you feel safe?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do. I think like Troy mentioned earlier, you're often not going to go into housing units, that you'll probably be, if you're going to meet one-on-one with individuals or even in a group setting, you'll likely meet in more of an administrative area. And my experience has been that there's always security nearby. Whether that be just sort of posted outside the room, so you have that confidentiality and, you're able to have that private conversation. They're there at the ready. I find that the first time I go into a facility, even though I've been to facilities all across the nation, the first time in a new facility, I am a little bit, I don't know if it's nervous, but I don't know the lay of the land. So one of the first things I always like to do is to, like we talked about earlier, go in, take a tour, see what the facility is like, kind of understand, learn from the facility staff about who the inmate population is. Like Troy has talked about, there are different security levels, different kinds of inmates that are there. If there are any challenges the facility is facing, I like to kind of be fully informed before, and then the next time I go in, I feel more comfortable with my surroundings. So the long and the short of it is that I do feel safe. While I do go into segregation units as part of my work, if I was an advocate going in and providing services, that's not an area I would go into, or housing units. I would just work with the facility to find, determine what is the best place to have, provide services. Nicole or Troy?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say I totally agree with everything you said, Tara. And I was just thinking back on last year, I was very pregnant, and a lot of my family members were like, "Are you sure that's safe?" And honestly, like you said, yeah, I felt really safe. And in terms of the facility staff, that's their number one priority is your safety. And so it's really important for you to know that. And it's helpful to do a tour, like Tara said, and have a conversation with them. But just know that their number one thing is keeping you safe. And, even if you're meeting someone, for example, outside, like at the hospital, even there, like security is always their top priority. There'll usually be multiple, at least 2 officers with 1 inmate at the hospital or in transportation. And like Tara said, in the facility, there's always going to be someone right there. So yeah.
I don't think you'll have any problems. I think that you'll be okay.
Yeah, well, Trey, it's funny that the way that you said that, I often realize that inmates know that I am not of the facility. They know I don't work there. They know I'm an outsider. And there's something about that in and of itself that makes a relationship different than the relationship they have with facility staff.
Absolutely.
And I think, I don't know, but my experience too is that the word gets out. Like the word gets out very, very quickly about who you are, why you're there, and whether or not you can be trusted.
Thank you. The last question we have is, my organization serves both a local jail and a state prison. Is there anything I should keep in mind about services for these different clients? inmates?
Yeah, so a couple of things, and I'll have, certainly Trey and Nicole weigh in as well. Like we talked about earlier, a local jail, a couple of things. One, it's a place where someone may be serving, if they have been sentenced, it's a short period of time, or it may be someone who is awaiting trial or that kind of thing. So they may not be at the facility for a very long period of time, which means that they may be, you may meet with them a couple of times and then they're no longer there. And that may be because they've been released back into the community, or maybe they've been sentenced and now they're going on to a state or federal prison. Thinking about someone that's also in a jail, thinking about if they tell you, or you get the sense that they may be released soon, making sure that they know how to get continued services in the community. Also thinking about, prisons do tend to be, people are there for longer periods of time. So you're more likely to be able to establish a long-term relationship with someone in that facility. The other thing to think about is that jails, are, because they tend to be locally operated, you may be drawing, they may be having individuals in their custody who are from your local community. So that's just something to keep in mind, that depending on how large or small your community is, you may actually know people that are being held at that facility. But in the opposite way, prisons, if it's a state-run facility, for example, they tend to be located, all over the state, often in rural areas, but they're drawing from individuals from all across the state. So if someone is soon to be released, they may not be released into your community. They may be released across the state. And so if there's a way for you to provide them with information about resources in their home community, that would be tremendously helpful. Nicole or Troy?
I agree.
Yeah,
I agree.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I agree too. And I'll leave it at that so we can move on.
All right, we'll go on to the next one. I just want to thank everyone for your questions. They're really good ones, and we'll provide our contact information in a moment, but please know that we are here for you. So if you have additional questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us after today's webinar. So again, I just wanted to mention some of our resources. You can certainly go to a slide for, sorry, and check for a second here. Aha, there we go. I wasn't expecting that to happen. So there are a lot of advocate resources available on our website. So things that I mentioned here, an advocate's manual, SART toolkit. We have lots of archived webinars that we've done for a lot of different audiences. You can also request assistance from us. And also it's available on our website, but you can also reach out to the PREA Resource Center, and they're a federally funded source of resources and technical assistance for jurisdictions. But here's our link. You can go to justdetention.org and certainly find your way to the advocate resources. Or if you want to take a moment and write this down, justdetention.org/advocate-resources. And again, there's a lot of different, there's sample MOUs, fact sheets, other tools that are available to you. Nicole mentioned during her remarks, but I just wanted to again point you towards this terrific resource, Hope for Healing. This free publication can be found under the quote-unquote publications for service providers from our website on the page I just mentioned. And it's a manual for advocates to assist them in providing services to incarcerated survivors. So again, you can find this on our website under Advocate Resources. And if you have trouble finding that, please let us know and we'll point you in the right direction.
And sorry to interrupt, Tara, but I figured I just should share it on the chat since we've been doing that.
Oh, so good.
The link.
So I keep her around. So that's great. Thank you. And finally, we have a resource guide for survivors of sexual abuse behind bars. And this guide lists legal and psychological counseling resources by state for survivors who are still incarcerated, for those who have been released, and for loved ones on the outside who are searching for ways to get help. So if your agency is interested in being listed as a resource, you can fill out a form found on the link on your screen, and maybe Nicole will put that in there too. But again, it's on our website, and you can just check to see if if the state coalition is listed, if your agency is listed, and if not, we can certainly add that. And last but not least, I just want to thank you all so much. I'm going to turn things over to Leah in just a moment, but it really has been a pleasure to present this webinar. Thank you to all of you for participating and for your questions. I also really appreciated your openness and sharing your thoughts during those different kind of like audience response periods. And again, don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or need technical support. Both JDI and the Resource Sharing Project provide that technical assistance to you as advocates and coalitions around the country as you work to provide services to incarcerated survivors. You can always contact us at advocate@justdetention.org, and we'll get back to you within 2 business days. And of course, be sure to sign up. We have a newsletter that comes out periodically, or follow us on Facebook or Twitter. But that's a way that you can also stay abreast of our work and resources that are available. And with that, Leah, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to OVW, of course, for funding our project. Thank you to JDI for partnering with us on this technical assistance project. Special thank you so much to Troy Isaac for joining us for this webinar and providing a real world experience and lens at this issue. And I just want to say, if you enjoyed this webinar, if you felt like it was helpful, we are going to be presenting a webinar. JDI and I will be presenting a webinar August 15th on the specifics of providing hotline services to incarcerated survivors, with an emphasis, of course, on rural programs. We're going to cover some of the challenges that folks have had around establishing agreements with facilities, confidentiality, and of course, just technology in general. So please join us for that. If you would like to register for that webinar, just check out the resourcesharingproject.org, or if Terry, you can just switch to the next slide. You're also welcome to just email me, and I can hook you up with the registration link. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.